All right, everybody, let's get started. Hopefully you found the James Comey speech interesting. I started taking a look at your submissions this morning before I started recording this, and it looks like we got something out of it. I know we tend to think of Comey as being associated with Russia and all the election stuff, but that speech was actually pretty well covered when it came out because he was the first FBI director to really openly talk about some of the issues with discrimination and some of the problems with the relationship between law enforcement and minority communities. And obviously, I mean, you saw he defended law enforcement too. He went back in history. He talked about bias, but it was one of the more kind of open conversations that we've seen from someone at that high of a level. So I thought it was an interesting way to get started. Um, so we're going to get into part two of our look at race and ethnicity in the United States today, and just spend a little bit of time looking at how things like prejudice develop and discrimination develop, as well as a few examples that I think are worth taking a look at, and then we'll get into the three major theories: functionalism and interactionism and the conflict theory. So I like to start with this, and just think about it for a minute. What types of motivations and factors can cause people or groups to form prejudice or discriminate against each other? I think a lot of times when we talk about prejudice and discrimination, we tend to look at the effects, right? We say, oh, well, what was the action, or what was the condition that was created by a group that is discriminating against another? And obviously, the effects of prejudice and discrimination are important, both in terms of the scale and severity, as well as who it targets. Um, but I think a lot of times, at least in popular media, or even in just kind of people's casual conversations, we kind of jump right to the effects, the visible effects of discrimination and prejudice, and a lot of times we don't necessarily look at the sources of it, which is problematic because then it's like, I mean, you've all heard the expression of treating the symptoms and not the disease itself, or treating the symptoms and not the cause. Um, and I think that we see that issue come up a lot in at least the history of the United States and race relations. And I think in other parts of the world it's similar, but obviously we kind of focus on the U.S. in this class. Um, so let's take a look at a couple of things that are going to be, I think, important throughout the rest of this chapter in this unit. Um, so there's a couple of ideas that come out, that I think we need to get out there before we get more in depth with the three perspectives. One is, and it's one of the most, I think, credible, and I think it's one of the most accepted kind of explanations, because it is broad and it can be applied to a lot of things. But if you think about the process, it makes a lot of sense. Um, and that's this thing called the frustration aggression hypothesis. And basically, what that means is that minority groups, and this can apply to things other than race and ethnicity too. We're just talking about race and ethnicity right now. Is that smaller groups, minority in the purest sense of just being less people, um, are essentially used as scapegoats in many societies throughout history for societal ills. And I'm sure if you think back, you can think about a lot of examples in a lot of different points in history that this would apply to, not just in the United States. Maybe the most infamous 20th century version, that the German Jewish population and then the European Jewish population as a whole were scapegoated for the problems that Germany faced in the aftermath of World War One, which then leads directly to the Nazis and the Holocaust, right? The numbers that get thrown out are, the Jewish population in Germany was less than 1% of the entire population of the country. And that's kind of a classic, um, not example, but a classic kind of like number or ratio that you hear, is that a group that is that small, proportionally speaking, is often the target of scapegoating, because Just in a practical sense, as terrible as this sounds, groups that are doing the persecution or that are kind of forming the ideas for scapegoating, um, it's easier for them to target smaller groups because there's less people. If you try to scapegoat the majority group, they can push back. If you try to scapegoat a very small group, it is very hard for them to push back effectively. And there have been other examples too. In the United States, one of the things about slavery that you guys read about in some of the early articles was that slavery became race-based in the United States, at least in part, as a way to pacify the very poor white farming population in the country, with the idea that they were very aggravated that they didn't have these big plantations. But if you created a racial hierarchy where they were not on the bottom, it was kind of determined that you could basically prevent those groups from rebelling, because as long as you weren't the very bottom group, you had something to lose by fighting back. And that ties in with this idea of the frustration aggression hypothesis as well. So by focusing on these groups that cannot necessarily protect themselves, very small minorities, groups in positions of servitude like slavery, where they do not have legal rights. Those are the types of things we're talking about when we say you focus on groups that cannot protect themselves. And then in a broader sense, you also see prejudice and discrimination really become very prominent in any system. It doesn't have to be a dictatorship, but any system that is seen as very authoritarian, where basically one person or a very small group of people kind of control the social norms. And when that very small group or individual controls the norms of a society, or even of just a group within society, like business culture is a good example of this. There is an emphasis placed on kind of modeling yourself after whoever is in charge. And if you don't meet that kind of archetype, then you will be discriminated against. So here, let me throw something out with this. We've been talking a lot about race and ethnicity, but to give you an example of authoritarianism, not at like the dictator level, because that's obviously the more common one to think about. This is brought up when you talk about workplace culture and gender discrimination, because most of the, and this goes back even into the 1950s and 60s is when you started to see a little bit of research done about this. But all of the major CEOs were men, and women with the glass ceiling did not rise above a certain executive level. So you had this basically all male group of leadership, and then coincidentally, obviously I'm being sarcastic, you saw women being paid less, not getting promotions, complaints about things like sexual harassment not getting reported. And those are examples of things where, if you didn't conform to the office culture, you were viewed with, intolerance. So it cuts beyond just race and ethnicity. So what this leads us to is this idea of explicit and implicit bias too. So I like the iceberg metaphor. We all know that there's the part of the iceberg you see, the part that you don't. And with any group, we'll continue to talk about, race and ethnicity here. But with any type of bias, there's two things going on. There's what's called explicit bias, which are attitudes and beliefs that we have about a person or a group on a conscious level. We're aware of these so we can see them and report them. These are things like overt examples of discrimination or racism. A racially motivated attack, a visible form of discrimination, like telling someone they can't be served in your restaurant because of the color of their skin, visual or seen, so to speak, in quotes, versions of bias. And then there are things like implicit bias. This has to do with what are called unconscious attitudes that lie below the surface but may influence our behaviors. These are things where you start to associate people and groups with other things that may not necessarily be directly linked, but then it leads to bias. For example, people, we know this, there is an association in the United States with the inner city with poverty, drugs, and crime, right? That's something that is connected in a lot of people's minds. The argument would be that implicit bias then says that even if you're not consciously thinking of that, because proportionally speaking, there's a far higher percentage of minority Americans living in the inner cities, that they are then linked to that, and you associate those groups with poverty, crime, drugs, things like that. That's one of the most common versions of this that comes up. And implicit bias is unfortunately the trickier one to deal with, because it's a lot harder to find. Another example would be hiring practices. All right, you have two candidates who are equal in qualifications, but you select one candidate over another because they are more familiar to you. If you are, this is one of the things that comes up, not just with race but gender. When I talked about the glass ceiling, you saw a lot of men tended to hire more men. You saw that white company or companies that had a majority white employees tended to hire other white employees. This is argued as at least partially implicit bias. So where does this come from? One of the biggest examples is the media. And what I wanted to do today, just to kind of tease out before we get into the perspectives over the end of the week, a couple of really famous examples in the United States of how we think the media, whether it was intentional or not, very much tried or very much was seen as kind of like whipping up some more of this implicit bias. So take a look at these two pictures. I'm sure we're all familiar with O.J. Simpson. If you're not, he was a Hall of Fame caliber football player in the 1970s. Became a pretty popular like movie kind of like supporting actor. He was in like a lot of comedies and things in the 80s and 90s. Very, very popular, well-known celebrity, after his professional sports career. And then his ex-wife and her boyfriend were murdered, were stabbed to death. This brutal, brutal murder. And as I'm sure we know, OJ was put on trial. He was ultimately acquitted in a very, very racially charged, controversial trial. A lot of people think that he did it, and he got away with it. There was issues with some of the police investigating, saying racist stuff on tape. It was, like I said, it spiraled into this massive, massive kind of media circus. And these two magazine covers were part of this circus. And I think they're a really good example of how we see the media being able to potentially generate some sort of bias, implicit bias. So Newsweek and Time are two of the most credible magazines in the United States, or they have always been considered that. And that is actually the exact same photo. But as you can tell, the Time magazine photo was very much manipulated, right? It was darkened. And a lot of critics point to this and say, this is an example of Time basically trying to race bait with its cover by creating a darker, more sinister image of an African-American male. They are trying to play into the stereotypes that you saw in the documentary 13th about black men, especially because this involved him being a suspect in the murder of a white woman. The argument was that Time was playing into and sensationalizing something the way that lynchings had done in the 1800s all the way through to the modern era. So this was, viewed as a lynching by the media, metaphorically speaking. And I don't use that word lightly. There was a lot of criticism about the way that Time did this. And Time tried to defend themselves, but they didn't really, frankly, do a good job. So that's an older example, but I think it's probably the most famous example in the media. Now let me show you this. So this is kind of interesting. You see, this is the same ABC Channel 9 from the website. So the point is, it's the exact same local TV channel. It's not like it's two different local ABC affiliates. And they are two articles about burglary, right? Now, if you look at the images, the two articles, and actually I should have said, I'm sorry, even before that, look at the date, Monday, March 23rd, 2015. And again, I apologize for the blurriness. It's not perfect, but Monday, March 23rd, 2015. Monday, March 23rd, 2015. So two identical topics for articles. And what do you notice? Hopefully, you see that the three University of Iowa wrestlers are in their yearbook photos, right? Or in their, I should say, I believe those are their athletic photos. Suits, ties, not smiling. Well, the middle kid's smiling, but like just kind of looking right at the camera, like your kind of classic, like, athletic profile photograph, right? And then the four African American men, you see those are the mugshots, right? And we've all seen mugshots before. Let's face it, people don't typically look good in their mugshots. They are not well lit. Obviously, usually it involves being taken immediately after being arrested, so you are in a distressed psychological and emotional state. And so what you see is that while the three white kids from the University of Iowa who were arrested for burglary get their yearbook photos, the four black men who were not from the University of Iowa get their mugshots. And this is a way that bias gets created, implicit bias, where you say, oh, well, they're just photographs, but, the context comes into play. Because another thing that should be pointed out is that anytime you're arrested, you get a mugshot. So it's not like they didn't have mugshots for these kids. They did. They just chose to use the yearbook photos instead, and went right to the mugshots for the four black men who were charged with burglary. So that's another good example. And then this one is another pretty recent one that came up. So we all recognize Giselle and LeBron James. And I show you this because Vogue, I mean, obviously Vogue's not a news magazine, but Vogue is still considered, one of the more prestigious publications in the world, obviously more in the fashion world. But you've probably seen the image on the left. It's like the classic propaganda image from World War I in every American history textbook basically ever printed. So that is one of the most widely circulated pieces of propaganda in not even just the United States. That's like one of the most famous pieces of propaganda ever. So the point is, like, a photographer for Vogue would have seen this already. It's actually in the Holocaust Museum in Washington as an example of how propaganda dehumanizes people. So obviously that's related to Germany in World War One. And the threat that the German beast was, going to pose to Lady Liberty, right? The gorilla has the hat on. This is right around the time that like the King Kong idea was popularized, so like they kind of played into that. So kind of silly propaganda image about Germany. Now, go over to Vogue. You see like LeBron is posed in a very similar stance, right? Kind of crouched over, arms out. Giselle is obviously smiling, is a little different in that sense, but they had him, open his mouth. She's wearing the exact same color, the exact same style dress. And this created a lot of controversy because, even if you say it was unintentional, and I should point out, LeBron was asked about this, and he did not feel, to the best of my knowledge from what I read, that they did anything deliberate in terms of trying to racialize or trying to play into any sort of stereotype or kind of racial imagery. But you can't help but notice the similarity. And as you guys know from the lectures, from the documentary, from our readings, one of the most vicious and one of the oldest racialized images in existence in the United States is the portrayal of African Americans, and specifically African American men, as ape-like, right? Is dehumanizing them. It's like I said, one of the most kind of vicious and insidious images that's ever existed in this country, and has very deliberately been used. The word monkey has been used as a racial slur. There's countless examples of that. So that was the argument that was made when this cover came out, was how could you possibly do this and not think that it was something that would be seen as, basically whipping up this type of implicit bias. So I show you these three images, to kind of go back to cycle through them, 1, 2, and 3, because they're three very different examples. We have the covers of nationally circulated news magazines, right, and a celebrity, but something that everybody sees. We see the same issue at the local level. This takes some digging. This is not something everybody in the United States would see unless it had been nationalized. And then we see, even in the arts, because fashion, it's an art form. We see the same issues coming up. And all of this kind of goes back to this idea of what generates potentially these attitudes, whether they're conscious or unconscious, right? And then when we get into the effects of these, which we will towards the middle and end of the week, this is one of the bigger problems that we see in the United States, is how do you combat imagery like this, and ensure that it is not perpetuating some of these biases, and how do you prevent, kind of this blatant selectivity in how people are portrayed in the criminal justice system, or again, how do you prevent sensationalization of racial imagery in a way that has these negative impacts, and that all will lead us back to explicit and implicit bias. Okay, so that's it for today. Like I said, I just kind of wanted to start with that. I'm asking you to take a look at this, and this is your assignment to do for today and tomorrow. I want to give you a little extra time because a lot of people are taking APs. And then Thursday and Friday of this week, we'll look at part 3. All right. Have a good one, guys.